Welcome to the Explore Words, Discover Worlds podcast, presented by Bradford Literature Festival. This episode takes us on a journey through the world of fantasy literature and the legacy of one of the greatest pioneers. While fantasy certainly existed before Frodo, Gollum and Middle-earth, as soon as visionary author J.R.R. Tolkien picked up his pen, the genre was never the same again. Acclaimed author Courttia Newland joined David Barnett for a discussion about Tolkien's vast impact within literature and how his writing has influenced them personally as writers. Originally recorded at the 2022 Bradford Literature Festival, this episode discusses the vast impact of Tolkien's writing on the genre of fantasy and on their own work as writers.
Good afternoon. Thanks for coming on such a lovely day. This is Courttia Newland, and we're going to be talking, well, in the book it says we're going to be talking about Tolkien, which is a fairly wide-ranging subject and influences of Tolkien. We're both writers. Neither of us write Tolkien-esque fantasy, no. I would say.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's always going to be first time. So, I mean, you, Courttia, have had like a massively varied career. You've, I mean, it's a literary festival, and the thing I should be most impressed about is your 10 books, and your
9, I think.
9 books,
yeah,
and almost the same number of plays.
Yeah.
Writing for small acts for the TV series. But you had a drum and bass record out in 1997, which is like...
If I had one out in 1977, I would have
been... you'd been well ahead of the curve.
Yeah.
But, so, yeah, that's a varied career. We're going to talk about your books in a little bit about and how Tolkien, if at all, has had an influence. But should we talk about how did you discover Tolkien?
Well, I mean... In short, I'll answer the first question, and I know we'll go into more detail afterwards, but in short, I mean, has Tolkien been an influence on me? The answer is yes, massively. Influenced like everything I do, even if it doesn't look like it. I think you can see his like little imprint in me throughout, because it was when I'm not meaning to brag, this is not a humble brag, but just to some context. My mum and everyone in my family have always said, like, I basically taught myself to read when I was like 2 or 3. There's pictures of me in my cot, like just lying with like my hand, chin in palm, and reading. So, and the reason I say that is because basically, when that happens in a kind of inner city place like London, a working class kid, black boy, who's really, really into reading, what happens is that everybody gives him every book they can find, basically. They're pulling books from the shelves, like, he reads, give him books. And I was getting books from everywhere. And so my uncle, I think it was him that gave me The Hobbit first. And he gave me that when I was 6 or 7. And he said, you've got to read this. Like, this is a must. There's no way that you can go through life having not read this book. So I read it and obviously loved it. And then, and this is the bit that really gets me, because like, I swear, I must have been 7 or 8. And he's like, here's Lord of the Rings, now start on that. and I'm laughing at it, and I don't mean to laugh, because in some ways it was a really brilliant thing to do, because he was just like, yes, you can read this. I don't want to hear any excuses about you not being able to read it. It was expected that I would read it. And so I read it. So, and I just loved it.
It's a leap though, isn't it? It's like...
it's completely different.
It's like, the nearest analogy I've got is like when I did O-level physics, then I did A-level physics, and I thought, this is just like another universe of stuff that I can't wrap my head around.
Well, my analogy is 9 books, and then doing a PhD. There's no, like, I would much rather write 9 books than write one PhD. To me, that leap was so huge. And yeah, it just blew my mind. So it was that type of leap when I read it. But I don't know. I don't know. Just something, I was absolutely captivated. I cannot tell you. And I had the old cover, because this was in the 70s. So I had the old cover with the Night Riders on the front and the horses with the red eyes, the dark horses with the red eyes, you know. And I loved all that stuff. I was really into Star Wars. I was really into like I had a big poster of Vader in my room, you know. So my granddad, who's from Kingston, Jamaica, would come into my room and see this big poster and be like, "Why has he got that poster in his room? Aren't you scared? That's the most horrible thing I can think of, big Vader poster." Yeah, but like, yeah, I was just really into this stuff, and the darker and the more science fiction or fantasy it was, the better for me. And I just ate up that story. I loved the fact also that it was related. You had Bilbo Baggins in, but it wasn't about Bilbo Baggins. It was like an extended story of Bilbo Baggins and everybody else, and all the characters. Some of the characters we met already in The Hobbit. That was something that straight away did something in my head. And I was writing those days as well. I was writing stories. I was attempting to write books for the first time, only properly when I was like 10, 11, or maybe 9, because it was before I went to secondary school. I'd started to write, and I was trying to write fantasy stuff in response. And then after I'd read Lord of the Rings, I was saying to my mum, I want to read the Silmarillion. I want to read The Adventures of Tom Bombadil. And I was making my mum go to the bookstores and look for this book, which she couldn't find in Shepherd's Bush. She couldn't find it. And we went for ages, like looking for it. I wanted to read those things. And then I branched out. Then she did get me the Silmarillion, and that was too much.
Yeah.
I couldn't get it. I couldn't do that.
Did you finish it?
No, I didn't finish it. But
has anybody finished the Silmarillion? Yeah.
Wow, amazing.
Yes.
Hats off to you. Yeah, you too, sir. Hats off, man.
I finished it, but I'm not sure I understood it.
Yeah.
You turned the pages to the end. So, I'll tell you one of the weird things that it's like I'm probably just a year or two older than you, but growing up working class in the 70s, and I read The Hobbit, which seems a really weird thing to say today, knowing nothing about it. It was like, I just,
nice.
I think I got the book from the library or something, thought this looks all right. And
Yeah.
like, hadn't heard anything about it because there was unless you were among people who were talking about that sort of stuff.
No.
You didn't know about it. So it was I used to read books that I had no idea if Tolkien was alive or dead, or if he'd written it in 1976 or, whatever he'd written it. So it was like, it was quite interesting to come into it cold in a way, wasn't it?
It was, yeah. It was strange, and it was I don't know, it didn't feel abnormal though, in a weird way. It felt like totally normal. And I never started trying to imagine what Tolkien looked like. I never tried to find out any more about Tolkien. I was just thoroughly interested in this world, and this thing that he'd created. And I was in awe. It was definitely the first time I can remember being in awe of an author's creation. You know what I mean? I was like, I want to know everything about that. Yeah, and the languages and everything. Like I can't remember. That was the first time I remember being that immersed.
Did you watch the animated film at any point?
Of course.
Yeah, that was.
Of course. Yeah. And I was really upset when they didn't finish it.
I know, it was like, where's the rest of it?
It's like, are you telling me, what do you mean there's no more? And because I loved it. I thought it was amazing. And I have somewhere in my my stuff, which there's lots of stuff and it's scattered all around the place. I'm not actually sure where it is. I bought a still from it. When I first got my first advance as a writer, I went into a shop that was selling like memorabilia and stuff, and it had stills of the
like the animation cells and stuff.
Yeah, and you could buy a cell, and I can't even remember how much I paid for it, but I got it, and it's in a box somewhere because I was so like, well, I have that, that like, yeah. So yeah, definitely. I don't know. I was going to say more geeky than I look, or maybe as geeky as I look. I don't know, but definitely that. Yeah.
I think one of my favourite bits of sort of like Lord of the Rings trivia really is. Did you ever have the big poster with Gandalf, the two hobbits, and it was
no, I know the poster.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Which was drawn by Jimmy Courttia,
mm-hmm.
who later went on to be in the KLF, which is just like one of my favourite bits of trivia that he just because it was like a big bestseller. Does anyone know the poster I mean? It was kind of like yeah, it's got little images around the outside, and it was like very kind of like pastoral and folky looking, and all like watercolours and I think. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And it was like kind of like in the 70s, like every self-respecting hippie had that on the wall. Then I later found it was by Jimmy Courttia from the KLF, which I just thought was like a mad thing.
That is mad.
But sort of like Tolkien's kind of influence into popular culture at that time often tended to go in like through sort of like prog rock albums and things like that, and kind of like Roger Dean.
I was completely
sleeves and stuff.
unaware, because obviously, like, there was no prog rock around me at the time.
No.
I was definitely like Scientist and Yellow Man, and that's what was going on for me. And then the pirate radios in London at the time, the pirate radio stations. So I was definitely. It's now when I think about it, it's so crazy because it was completely alternate to my world.
Did you know anybody else who was reading Tolkien and stuff at that age? Your contemporaries, sort of thing.
Not Lord of the Rings. Some people, The Hobbit was in our school.
Yeah.
And so some people had read The Hobbit. Not it wasn't, I wouldn't say it was a fan favorite or something like that, but definitely people could talk about The Hobbit and reference The Hobbit and stuff. But when it came to Lord of the Rings, I can't remember it. There might have been somebody, but I can't remember them if there was. What about you?
No, I was like the geeky outsider at school, so it was I think by the time I read Lord of the Rings, which I was probably about 11 or 12, so I moved to secondary school, high school, there was more of an awareness of it amongst people, but I don't think many people at my school had bothered to read it. But
I think people watched the films when it came on TV. I think people did watch that. But no one, you didn't have conversations about Lord of the Rings. And sometimes people would reference it. And then sometimes in the music, people would reference it as well. There was like rappers who would reference Lord of the Rings. You knew some people because rappers are.
That's quite niche, that, isn't it? So.
It was niche at the time as well. Like I said, in the early 80s, like the early days of hip hop, it was niche. But like most of those guys were geeks too. People don't realize that about rappers. Rappers are generally geeky people. You know what I mean? Like they're obsessive as well. So I think lots of people obsessed about it, like I did. Yeah.
Did everybody? I should actually rephrase that. Is there anybody who didn't read The Hobbit first? Like maybe went straight into the Silmarillion, which I imagine is unlikely, because you wouldn't have read any more. But anybody who sort of read Lord of the Rings, here's another one. Did anybody only really read Tolkien after the Peter Jackson films came out?
Nobody.
Everybody read it before the movies.
I have a question. Has anyone read the Bible all the way through? You have, yeah. I tried when I was a kid, but no, but because I just wondered.
Skipped around to the good bits first.
Because the Silmarillion, that's essentially what you'd be doing, right? You'd be reading the Bible of this world, and so I'd be very surprised if many people had read it all the way through. And I think you are probably meant to dip into it and dip out of it, or use it to kind of attach relevance to the events that happen later and stuff like that. But I just can't. Wow, what a mind.
Yeah. After you first read them for the first, did you kind of like stick with them, or was it something you kind of like read, moved on, and did you ever revisit kind of like much later in life and reread?
Yeah, I read them pretty much at the same time as everything else that I was reading, which was everything else that was being given to me and everything else that I wanted to read. Like I said, Star Wars and Lord of the Rings happened at the same time, So I never like just stuck to one particular thing. I've always gone all over the place, and that's reflective, I think, in my work. I think the first time I revisited it after being a kid, because it's like when you're a kid as well, it's like you read the same books over and over and over and over again. So I read The Hobbit as much as I could because I didn't have any other books. I couldn't afford to buy a lot of other books. So I did that again and again then. And then after that, I didn't read them anymore up until my son was born. And then I did like my uncle, I was like, here, like read The Hobbit, which he did. He was very resistant at first, He's much more I was into adult books from day one. And he's much more like, I want to be a kid, Dad. Stop giving me these big books. So he was resistant at first, and he's resistant to virtually anything I give him anyway. He really wants to read his own stuff. And then he did read it, and he really liked it. I don't think he's gone into Lord of the Rings just yet.
Do you think that is because sort of like books for children and young adults only became marketed as such much later on? It's sort of like something when I was growing up that there wasn't a huge, there was like your obvious little kiddie books.
Yeah.
And then there wasn't really that kind of demarcation between.
There wasn't that much. I mean, it was growing, I think, by the time I kind of trundled along. There was a book, I remember a series I read called The Starstormers. I've never met anyone else who's read this series, and I never read the whole series because, again, you couldn't get hold of the whole series. Like I got one, and then I got three, and then I'd have to go to secondhand bookstores and Shepherd's Bush Market to try and look for the others, and sometimes they turn up. But I think it was a British author, and it was about a group of kids. It's set in the future, and it was a group of kids whose parents had gone off to make money, and they'd left them in some kind of like a care home or something like that, and they decide to create their own spaceship to try and
that
find
rings
them.
a massive bell, actually.
Yeah, so they managed to build it or get it built out of an asteroid, and then a huge asteroid, and then they got in it, and then they flew off. It's like a pretty insane story, but it was really good. So I was there was stuff like that out, and there was one other series that I read as well, which was completely different, kind of more of a superhero space thing. But apart from that, there was The Hobbit was meant to be a kid's book, but Tolkien never wrote like he was really talking to kids.
Yeah. I mean, can you imagine the publishing industry today being confronted with the plan? Right, I'm going to write a children's book, and the sequel is going to be 3 adult books this thick. That just wouldn't happen today, would it, in publishing? And
it's going to be raw and scary, and it's going to be it's one thing that always gets me, which I didn't know about until later on down the line, as an adult, was that when people were revisiting it and it was like the greatest book of all time and all that kind of thing was going on, people were talking about, oh, I really like it, but there's too many lengthy descriptions, and there's that kind of thing. And I just, it never occurred to me that the descriptions were lengthy. So I don't know how you guys feel about that, because that's another thing that supposedly put people off.
I mean, there is that big question about, is Tolkien a good writer, or is his strength in sort of world building, creating this like amazing Middle-earth that you can believe happens because you've got so much history there that as fact goes back millennia. I mean, does anyone think Tolkien's a good writer? Would they class him as a good writer? Yeah,
definitely. But then I've never read him as a writer. I've only read him as a reader, and those are completely different things. But I would like to believe, from what I remember, and I'm scared to read him as a reader. Actually, I don't want that. I don't want to go back and be like, oh, I have to put my critical literary theory hat on,
critical writer's head on.
Yeah. I don't want to, but I would want to just read it as a reader again. I'm not sure if that's possible, but just what I remember, what I learned from him in those descriptions. That's why I was talking about that, because I am now being accused of the same thing. I've written a kind of like pretty epic, it was a 600 pages book, and it's not fantasy, it's not sci-fi, but it's an alternate world, all these kinds of things. And I know I'm massively influenced by Tolkien. And one of the things I really wanted to do was have immersive descriptions and stuff. And I think that there's 2 things that I really love. I love that, describing everything to the nth degree, because it really worked for me. It really gave me a picture of Middle-earth, and I could see it. It was playing like a film in my head because he did that. That was a major strength. But also,
are we talking?
Yes.
Do you want to tell us a bit about this? What
do you guys mind? I'm just going to veer off a little bit, because this is the influence, basically. For me, this book is me finally going into what I wanted to do when I was a kid, and I'd read The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. So this book is set in a. I'm glad you bought a copy. This book is set in a parallel world where slavery and colonization never happened. And so because those things didn't happen, ancestral worship, meditation, the chakras, astral projection are all normal and commonplace, and everyone believes them, even in Britain. And it's set in an alternate Britain. And Britain is kind of like the global seat of power is in the south. And Britain is like, it is how it is today, but people have obviously migrated to Britain in far greater numbers, and the dominant religion is African cosmology, basically, rather than Christianity, and that was favored by the Romans instead of Christianity, and it's led to just no one actually thinking about race in the way that we do today. It's not that they don't see race; they see differences between people and stuff, but it's not a big deal. And so I wrote this alternate world just because I thought it'd be really an interesting thing to do, and it was on my mind since I wrote my first book. I had the idea for it, and it took me like 20 years to actually complete the book. And I knew, and part of the reason it took me 20 years because I knew it was going to be this sprawling kind of massive book, and I couldn't find the time or the money to actually write it until I got a book deal for it. So I managed to get a book deal for it just after I've written Small Acts, just after I've written it, 2017, something like that. And then I wrote it after I'd finished the scripts and the series had been shot. I had like 6-month window basically to finish it, and I finished it. And people were saying in some of the reviews, I mean, most of the reviews were really, really good, but some of the reviews were saying that, there's so much description. And I was just like, yep. Even at the time before, I didn't know I was doing this event or anything. Before that, I was just like, yep, well, that's Tolkien. And another thing that is, I think Tolkien is really amazing at, I felt at the time, and I still feel, is voice, He has a very, very strong, distinctive voice. And I felt like I could hear this guy. I didn't know what the voice sounded like, but I had a representation of it in my own head. I could hear this person telling me this story when he's talking about like Bilbo, and he's talking about, especially in The Hobbit, the dwarves and they're in the mountain and stuff like that. And I just hear this person. It's like being sat down in front of a fireplace. It's like, okay, let me tell you the story of Bilbo and, everybody. And that went on into Lord of the Rings. So actually at the time, I really treated it just like a continuation of that story, and just went straight from The Hobbit into Lord of the Rings, and just couldn't stop. Really couldn't stop.
Did you? There are a lot of criticisms leveled at Tolkien today, from people who maybe come to it later, or people who sort of look at the books with through a contemporary lens, which is entirely natural. One of them is that women don't get much of a look in the books. Generally. And the other one is that, and I'm interested in this from your point of view, growing up as like a working class black kid in London. There's a lot of talk about racism in the books, which I didn't spot, but then as a white working class kid, I probably wouldn't. Was there anything evident in that to you, or was it something that was discussed later on?
I don't remember anything. And also there's the Peter Jackson depiction, which I get it. I get why people are upset about the Peter Jackson depiction, but I don't remember anything. But I'll jump forward and then I'll jump back. I don't remember anything, but when I presented Tolkien's books to my son, I also presented him with C.S. Lewis. And I gave him all those books because I read all those as a kid as well, And I loved them. They were the Narnia books. Loved them. I read everything. I just, again, straight through the whole series and stuff. I didn't remember ones being good or bad or whatever. I just was immersed in that world. I wanted to read everything that he'd written about that world. And I still like that now about things that I get obsessed about, authors or whatever. So that was the first beginning of that. But when I read, is it Prince Caspian? And I read it to my son, I was like, oh my God.
Is this one with the
there's this
I can't remember the name of the nation now.
There's a kind of like an Arabic-esque nation who are all dark skinned.
They're always described as like swarthy and sort of evil.
And they're evil and they're and I was just like, as soon as we got to it, let's just forget that, son. because I didn't, and this is the thing that was wrong about what was happening to me before. Like I said, everyone was just giving me the books. So I read a lot of stuff that I shouldn't have been reading, like concerning race, concerning sex, because I was just given everything, and no one was checking what I was reading. And I always said as I got older, I was like, I wouldn't do that to my kid. I want to read the books that he's reading. And so, I was reading this to him, and I got to that point, and I was like, I didn't close it at first. I kind of like tried to explain it to him.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because I think that's important. And then I was like, we kind of drifted away from those books because there was no real way of, even though I could explain it, it would still be doing damage if we was to carry on. I was worried about the damage and just to be clear, just viewing yourself in that way, thinking about your skin being associated with evilness, it's really difficult, you know? And there's no way that I could, as much as I wanted to try and contextualize that, there was no way that I could find myself able to until he was older, maybe. And I don't also want that influence on him. I'm not sure what it's going to do. And so I'd rather just not have that around for a while. And let's just think about your skin in great ways, you know what I mean? And then we'll come back to that maybe. So I say that because I'm not sure if the same things were in Lord of the Rings because I haven't come back to it in that way. I don't remember it in The Hobbit. But I also think, you know, there's a kind of idea that because we're two things. Let me go back. First thing is everything I read at that time had those things in it in the 70s. I mean, like I would always read books and be upset. Stephen King upset me every single book because he would always say something about black people, and I loved Stephen King and I had every one of his books, but I knew Stephen King was going to upset me. I knew most of the books that I read were going to upset me in some way. So it is possible that I read Lord of the Rings and encountered these things and thought it was normal because I was undergoing such massive racism at the time in my world, in life, they normalized it. And that's what I didn't want to happen to my kids.
Right. That's interesting.
So I probably didn't notice if it was there.
Yeah.
Is what I'm
so
saying.
even if it was like subliminally going in, you'd think, well, this is kind of situation normal in a way.
I would notice. I would read it and I'd be like, oh God, that really hurts. Because the kids at my school would be saying stuff like that too. And when I was very, very young, I was brought up in an all-white environment. I was like the only black kid for miles around. So I was acutely aware of race earlier than I should have been, which is another thing that I didn't want my son to be. I didn't want to. Part of the reason why I started thinking about this, I think it comes from that. But yeah, I would encounter things and I would be hurt. It would really hurt me. And then I would just be like, I'm going to read on anyway because I love this book. And I forgive you, Stephen or Tolkien or whatever. So and then later on, people would get upset about it, and I would learn that other people were feeling the same as me.
Yeah.
I tell you another thought that I was having before, which I kind of trailed off of a little bit, was that these books are these books, right?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I feel like whether it's Huckleberry Finn or whether it's Tolkien or whether it's like leave them alone. I feel like leave them even, and I'm not going to stress too much about this, but even Kate Clancy's book, you know what I mean? I feel like leave them alone. They're representative of things that happen. They're representative of our humanity, like it or not. They're representative of the society that existed and still does exist. And what we need to do is we need to be able to critically engage with these books and discuss how they happen, why they happened, choices the author might have made then that they probably might not make now or might have made anyway or anything. You know, like have a conversation about these books. That was why they were written, for us to have conversations and discuss about them. I do not, and a lot of people talk about cancel culture and all that. Like, I strongly believe we should point these things out, but I don't think we should change the books. Or we should I don't know, man. I don't see the point. Like if you can say something in this current time, like, I don't know if you guys know about Lizzo. You know, she used a really a terrible word, like which is used to describe people with physical illness, and she didn't mean it in that way. She didn't use it in that way, but there was an uproar online and stuff, and she changed it. I mean, she changed. It was a song.
Did you not agree with that? Changing it, or
no? In that context, I agree with it because there's something you can do about it now.
Yeah,
and people let you know. And I don't think that every time the audience says something, we as artists should be like, oh yes, we're going to just change it to suit you. There are things I wouldn't change, but there are things I'm sensitive to, and I've tripped up. We all trip up every now and then. I've said things that I shouldn't say, and luckily an editor has said to me, oh, maybe that's not the best choice of phrasing, Courttia, and I've changed it. Like I'm not like, oh, I'm here and it has to stay as it is. But these guys, some of whom who have passed away, some of whom who the books have been published already. Some, you know what I mean? Like I think personally, and I don't know, I'm sure many authors would disagree with me, but I feel like leave them alone, discuss them. Let's talk about it. Surely, you know. And I don't know that many people who are calling for anything different. This whole thing about cancel culture is actually grossly misrepresented, I think, a lot of the time, because what we're actually saying is let's have a discussion. Let's be clear about how this happened. In Huckleberry Finn, what was the environment or world which led him to say this character to say these things or to treat him that way? So sorry if that was it. Over lengthy.
No, it's Bob, and it is the fact that, you know, if you're looking at a book that's like, you know, not far off a century old, it's things are going to be different. People in 100 years are going to look back at our culture, and there's going to be stuff we don't think is problematic is going to be picked over.
Oh, completely. And I can look at my books in the 90s and be like, oh, I shouldn't have said that. That is definitely not, that would not fly right now. And I got told off really early by my girlfriend at the time, who read one of my books, and she was like, you cannot use that phrase to discuss people. You know, you cannot. And I was like, oh God, yeah, no, I can't. Yeah, it's just something that we said that I hadn't thought about. And no one's immune, you know, like, we're not trying to suggest. I have regularly sensitivity readers. You know, I don't call them that. I've never called them that. They're just people who check my stuff to make sure I don't get stuff wrong or I don't slip up. That's, I mean, editors, but editors who are my friends and people who I give my stuff to just to double check, and you can still make mistakes.
I mean, and the thing with Tolkien, when Lord of the Rings was obviously out a long time, but it seemed to get massive resurgence in the 60s and 70s. A lot of kind of like hippies discovered it and took it on board, and then they became writers. So like from the 70s and into the 80s, there were a lot of fantasy trilogies, especially, that were written, and everyone was sort of like had a blurb on the front saying, "Oh, this is comparable to Tolkien," and it's like, and like to get everybody into that. And then what we think of as fantasy, and certainly epic fantasy stuff, literature, became very kind of like Eurocentric in a way, didn't it? Everything was based on a kind of like medieval European culture. And it took a long time for that to change. And there are a lot of writers like yourself, and I mean, there were writers like Octavia Butler and Samuel Delany who were doing more science fictional stuff. But there is a very much a shift away from just this Eurocentric fantasy today, isn't there?
Yeah, there's a small shift. I'm kind of, because I'm thinking of things like Elder Scrolls and stuff, and that's still dominant, you know. But yeah. I mean, definitely, you know, he obviously influenced by Nordic myths and things like that, and European myths, and that's fair enough, you know. But I think people are trying to say, okay, because like for me, for instance, personally, I don't. That's not pervasive for me, you know. Like I'm used to the myths and legends that I grew up with, the cultural things that. So I think people are generally just trying to reflect the things that they grew up with and the things that they knew, and that's what I'm doing in this book. But also, I've got a collection of short stories called Cosmogramma, and it's just came out after this, and that also I'm trying.
Funnily enough.
Thank you. Yeah, again, trying to riff on like, you know, the myths and legends that come from our culture. And I'm sorry if I go on about this, but that is not to say we're negating anybody else's. We're like, put it all in and let's all talk about all of our influences, you know, and see where that brings us.
Absolutely, yeah, and it's like with so many things in culture, it's a case of that one version of it has been the dominant force, and it's now it's people are looking at other voices and looking at other cultures for this. I used to write a bit of science fiction, and my agent at the time, I was just saying, fantasy is by far the biggest seller in genre fiction of that kind. That's what everybody wants, is this big epic fantasy that really all stems from Tolkien in terms of like modern publishing.
Not just publishing. I mean, Game of Thrones is obviously been influenced by Tolkien as well in some way. You know, there's definitely a correlation between, you know, him and what you know he was doing. You know, so I think Yeah, that's undeniable. And yeah, it's strange because I suppose I veered off of fantasy actually. You know, I went more into science fiction. And I don't know if that's because I felt like how do I live in that world as myself? It's all right as an escapism from myself, but like how do you if I was to even now when I think about it sometimes it does cross my mind. I'm like, oh, I'd love to do a little fantasy series or something. I'd love to write something because like the rapper Yasin Bey said, all people who love art eventually try to make it. You know what I mean, in some way or another. So I'm thinking, oh, I love this. I'd like to. How would I interpret it? And I've always found it. I'm not sure. You know, like how do I do it in a way that feels comfortable to me and that I can shape things in terms of the things that I want to say. And I haven't really yet found that. But I think that's why I went into more science fiction because there seemed like a route. There seemed like an avenue. And there's also precedence, you know.
I'll tell you a question that used to vex me when I was a kid, and I used to spend too much time thinking about this. Was that is Middle-earth on another planet, or is it in another reality? And I used to think about this. I thought, if it's on another planet, that really makes this science fiction.
Yeah.
Can anybody answer that for me now? It's like, what?
My theory was different.
How does this work?
My theory was literally, and this is what comes with being a kid. My theory, I took it so literally that I believed it was in Earth. It was another part of
like
Earth.
At the Earth's core.
Yeah, somewhere like you could. I obviously hadn't really worked on how these things work. I hadn't thought about it at 8 years old, but I was like, it's Middle Earth, right? You go down somewhere and it exists, and there's another plane inside the Earth where all these things happen. And I always imagined it this way. And now I think about that, I'm just like, what?
I know. It's like another one of my theories, and this is like purely as a result of growing up in the 80s, was that it was a post-apocalyptic scenario.
Yeah.
Millions of years later. After, so it was like, but it's. I think our this age of discussion is over, and let's all go to our hobbit holes and cool off. So thank you so much, and Courttia, thank you so much.
Thanks, guys.